Well, the first speaker to the stage, which is Andreas Habersetzer. He is a partner for EY, been in payments world for a long time, and he's going to discuss the developments that are happening in open banking and PSD2. Andreas, the stage is yours.
All right. Yeah, and I directly didn't stick to the brief to talk about acquiring 2.0 and is already speaking now about open banking. But as you said, it's all very much related. Yeah, I'm Andreas Habersetzer, leading the EY payments across the EMEA region. In addition to that, I'm also leading the general financial service strategy team in the UK, and in that context I'm leading a lot of the strategic or supporting players on the strategic responses to open banking and PSD2, and that's why I thought, why not speak about payment strategies in an open banking world. The agenda is fully packed, yep, and I have limited time, so I'm going to skip through some items, but you're going to get the presentation, and I'm always available for questions as well. So first point is about global open banking initiatives, and the point I would like to make in that chapter is really that call it PSD2, call it open banking, it's nothing that is limited to UK, to continental Europe, it's really a global initiative, and if you're thinking about implications on payments and payment strategies, then you need to think it as well from a global perspective. Second point is then, what are the implications on payment service providers? And the third one is, how can PSPs respond to that challenge? I will not bore you with what is PSD2 and so on, because I know you're all very well informed. We have in the UK open banking, as it's called, since 1st of January last year. PSD2 is well underway as well, and although both at very different starting points, the scope is now very much aligned. And for both, one principle in common is that it shall provide regulated third-party providers, be it AISPs or PISPs, access to online account data if the customer consents. And based on that, new business models, new value propositions, improved processes are currently developed by players in the UK and outside in other markets. While PSD2 and open banking in the UK and in continental Europe have been regulatory-driven initiatives, and we see other markets that follow suit, most notably Australia, where we're going to have open banking coming into force later that year. We have initiatives in Mexico and Brazil that follow very much in particular Brazil follows very much the UK approach to open banking. Mexico is on a similar route. So there are a couple of markets globally that will go down the path comparable to a UK or Europe, where open banking will be part of a regulatory initiative. But there are other markets as well, and I think here we have to highlight the US in particular, where it's mostly driven by industry participants. So banks like Citi or others are publishing open APIs, and based on that, new propositions are being developed. I'm going to skip the exact timeline for each and come to the result of a survey that we have done or detailed research, because we often get the question from players in the market. So is open banking a real thing? When will it come to life? How are customers reacting to open banking? And how is adoption actually? So we developed this open banking opportunity index, and it's based on 4 criteria that I cannot always recall. So it's, how is the regulatory environment in the market? How is the adoption potential? So meaning how is generally the acceptance of new propositions driven by fintechs and other players? How is consumer sentiment towards open banking? And how is the general innovation environment? If you put all this together with a lot of research and customer service and so on, maybe kind of surprising the outcome at first. So completely unbiased, the UK lands on top, followed by mainland China and Singapore. If we look at UK and China in comparison, they have very different approaches towards open banking. The UK, very regulatory driven, standardized APIs. The banks are forced to implement the APIs, forced to lay their customer data open with a lot of investment, costs a lot of pain. And then if you speak to the customer or the consumer, would you actually like to adopt this? Would you be comfortable sharing your data with even if it's a regulated third party? There's a big hesitation in the market as well. Key problem is that consumers don't really understand if you don't understand open banking or PSD2 unless you explain what is really the benefit of such an initiative. So can they save costs? Can they get better products? And so on. Then they get convinced that open banking might actually be to the benefit of them. China, very different approach. I'm not sure if the word data protection or customer protection exists in Chinese. But of course, yeah, a very open environment with regard to data access, data sharing, APIs, and we all know the ecosystem approach of the likes of Alipay and WeChat and so on. So quite different approaches, but lead to a similar outcome in terms of how ready is a market for open API structures. Back to the UK now, and we always get the question, what's happening in the market? What is actually from the provider side? Is there innovation coming to the market? Because one of the key goals of open banking is to foster new propositions, to foster innovation. And the answer is clearly yes, there's big interest from the provider side. So if you look at the FCA website, that's all public information, you see the number of registrations. There are currently about 100 licenses granted to about 70 institutions. So meaning some have AISP licenses and some have PSP licenses together. But the vast majority of licenses have been granted for AISP, so not payment related. Some institutions demand for both. Just they have a clear AISP use case like business financial management, for example, or personal financial management, and a payment application might come at a later stage. So if you look who's actually focusing on a payment use case in the open banking context, then you get to a quite small number. And the names that probably stand out in this red box there are players like American Express, who are very much focused on payments, and they have an AISP and PISP license. And you have Go Cardless, who originally focused on direct debit. They just announced a funding round of $75 million US dollar that it will put to use and certainly leverage to come up with a new payment proposition that goes beyond direct debit. And what is interesting as well is certainly the right top bucket here. No, it doesn't. Anyway, the data aggregators. So these are, you could call them integration layers, or there are different names for that, but basically what they provide is a layer on top of different set of APIs in order to facilitate different use cases on top of that. So they can build a PISP use case or an AISP use case on top of that integration layer. So in theory, these are, and we have token here in the middle as well, they could be on top right as well. And they are the ones who announced first that they initiated actually a payment based on open APIs. So clearly a lot of activity in probably the most mature market with regard to standardized open APIs at the moment. And if you speak, a lot of that is driven by fintechs. So we saw Amex probably as the only name that comes from the incumbent world. If you speak to fintechs, then ask them, are you excited about open banking? Do you regard it as an opportunity? The answer is yes, yes, yes. We want to do open banking. And then on the right side, if you ask them, where do you spend your time with? Then it underlines what I just said, that the focus is at the moment not very much on payment, but on data aggregation use cases, credit scoring use cases, and other applications that require a AISP license rather than a PISP license. So the question is, no one touching payments really, not attractive. Will there actually no implications on the payments market at all coming from open banking? Or are these just the early days that we're seeing here? If you look at the payments market, just mentioned in the intro, if we focus on the right side at the moment and focus on the violet bucket here, then our colleagues from WorldPay expect that bank transfers would gain a share of the overall e-commerce payment mix over the next few years, adding 4 percentage points until 2022. If you then look at the volumes that are behind that, and if you think that beyond, in addition to bank transfers, current card payments are probably the most addressable ones through a PSP solution, then you get to a total volume of 557 billion in transaction volume. If you then think about in which use cases is a PSP or account-to-account payment most likely, you could come to the conclusion it's maybe also driven by the merchant, most likely in a high transaction value environment. So for example, airline tickets and white goods and other stuff. And if you look at these high value payments, then you land at a number of 315 billion. And back of the envelope, if you just assume that you have like 50 basis points average transaction cost for that assigned, then you come to a revenue pool of 1.6 billion in that year. Very simplified, but just to get a feeling for a revenue pool that is addressable with a PSP solution. So could argue it is a relevant value that is addressable here. So what are the implications for other players? So when PSD2 came out or was announced, then everyone said, oh, that's going to be the end of schemes. It's going to be the end of the merchant acquirer. So they're going to be cut out here, like on this beautiful chart on the left. But I think even though the cards might lose a few percentage points potentially, I think there's still a very relevant role to play for schemes and acquirers going forward. And they certainly will not lose their right for existence. What I find interesting is the question, will there potentially be another payment scheme going forward in Europe? So we have a number of very successful P2P initiatives across Europe, most notably in the Nordics, and they're currently working on interoperability already. We have the Benelux with ING has been initiating Payconic. We have Pay by Bank in the UK. We have initiatives in Poland and Spain and so on. So a very interesting question from my perspective is, could that be a path towards a new European P2P payment scheme? And what started here as consumer-to-consumer payment initiatives are now very successful already on the merchant side, if you look at the number of merchants accepting payments. So definitely initiatives that get traction. So if we look at the strategic response or strategies for payment service providers in an open banking environment, we already saw the banks, some of them taken the initiative already before PSD2, some in that context, and say we want to launch a new payment method that can address that particular use case. In addition, I find probably the banks are in one of the most interesting positions here, because some of them already decided a while ago, for good reasons or not, they want to exit the merchant payments market. Think about HSBC, think about Santander and others. Could a PSP solution potentially be a route back into payments, into merchant acceptance for a bank? That's a question we're currently discussing with clients as well. And in particular, if we think about the combination between payments and consumer lending and so on, it's a quite interesting proposition. If you think about other players, we have generally PSP. I already spoke about Go Cardless, a provider of one single payment method with the potential to add another use case. If you think more about online payment gateways, then it's probably rather a question adding another payment method. For the merchant acquirer, now we're finally back to acquiring 2.0. It's probably just adding another payment method and providing it to their merchants and making sure they remain relevant in the future. Depending if it's on the pricing of the payment method, there is additional revenue pool, but it's probably smaller from an acquiring perspective. I'm running out of time, but we often get the question by banks, by non-banks, any type of players, should I have a PISP? And how do we approach that? And I have the perspective or the opinion that in a few years, every bank will have in some form a PISP solution, be it in-house or be it provided by a third party. So I think that will be a very standard proposition in the payments environment. So, and if you think, when you think about that, then it's the question positioning. Of course, it's B2B versus B2C. And if you think about Deutsche, for example, announcing their proposition in payments focus on airlines and in cooperation with IATA, that's a quite interesting play. So do you want to have it consumer focused, business focused? Is it branded? Is it white label? So do you enable a ING Pay or a Tesco Pay? The question then around value proposition is clearly driven by pricing. How do you position it? Current thinking is that it will be very much positioned against the debit card. So it's in the region of 20 basis points that people are discussing. I think the merchant benefits are clear, lower cost for payment acceptance. The consumer benefits are much more challenging. And the question is it allowed from a regulatory perspective to provide incentives? Can you provide an enhanced payment experience? Can you combine it with a lending facility? And I think it's very easy to combine an account-to-account payments with a delayed payment, with a payment in installments, and so on. So there's a lot of room to play. Last but not least, the question, operating model. Do we build it in-house or do we work with a third party to provide it to us? And early indications are, and I'm quite surprised about that, a couple of players are actually going down the route to build it in-house. Sorry, I'm running out of time. There's just backup basically for what I just said. So I'm gonna jump to the conclusion and just, change the color compared to my slide here. Just on the conclusion, so open banking is a global topic. In particular, payments is a global theme. So if you think about a payment solution for an open banking environment, then it's really about making it global. Don't think only about your domestic market because it's not going to be lasting forever. It's a very sizable market. It goes into the billion, and it will be a very competitive environment. So this is certainly an environment where a lot of people are going to play, and you will need to have a clear value proposition and differentiation towards your competition. Thank you.